Steph?
Leah?
Jess?
Is this line secure?
Welcome back to Secure Line. I'm Leah West, joined with my co-host Stephanie Carvin. Jess Davis will be back with us next week. On Monday, the government passed its 2025 budget, Canada Strong, in a vote of 170 to 168, with a little drama at the end. The budget's priorities are clear, not only from its title, but from the image on its cover, a Canadian icebreaker docked in the north. Prime Minister Carney has touted the budget as generational. And while that may not be the case for every Canadian, it is safe to say that the investments in defense are transformational for the Canadian Armed Forces. Last week, Stephanie and Jess broke down the national security elements of the budget and told you that if you were interested in learning about the defense elements, that you should go read Philippe Lagassé's blog. Well, we've done one better, and we've invited him on to talk about the national defense and Canadian Armed Forces elements of this budget. We are very happy to have Phil here with us today. He has a fantastic Substack called Debating Canadian Defense. He's also the William and Jeannie Barton Chair in International Affairs at the Norma Patterson School and the principal at Lagassé and Lennox, a boutique research firm. Welcome, Phil. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks.
Okay, Phil, you're here, and the headline news was $81.8 billion of defense spending over 5 years, starting in fiscal year 2025-2026 for the Canadian Armed Forces and their associated defense and security programs. A lot of this is allocated to recruitment, retention, infrastructure sustainment, digital cyber capabilities, and strengthening the domestic industrial base. There's a lot there to unpack. So what do you make of this big, chunky number?
As you say, it's a lot of money. It's fairly ambitious, to say the least. Just to put it in context, the capital spend that the Trudeau government laid out in 2017 was $200 billion over about 20, 30 years. So when you're talking about $80.18 billion on a cash basis over 5 years, it gives you a sense of the scope of what we're dealing with, right? Now, the overall defense budget would have been a lot larger than that, but it gives you an idea of the level of ambition. That's probably comparable to the type of effort that we would have seen in the Korean War in terms of the level of investment at the speed that we're trying to achieve it. Your listeners may be aware that starting in 1957, we see a slow decline of the overall portion of the defense budget in Canada as a percentage of GDP. And this is the first time since that era that we've seen a significant uptick in that number.
So one of the frequent comments I would say on this is I've seen a lot of feedback saying, okay, great, this is a good start, but we're lacking in details. Leah, I think I just full on stole your line the other day where you're like, it's as if the Canadian government has brought the Canadian Armed Forces to the buffet, but not really given them any dietary restrictions, and they need to figure that element out. So I believe you've also suggested that the budget is vague on a lot of aspects of how this money is going to be spent. So is this a bad thing? Is this an okay thing? What are you expecting in terms of how this is eventually all going to unfold?
I think the government has a difficult balancing act to perform here, and it helps explain a little bit what it's done and why it's done it. So if you want to send a signal to Canadian industry that you really want them to invest and you want to build export market for Canada and you want to demonstrate to allies that you're serious and, all these things, you kind of need to demonstrate your seriousness. How do you demonstrate that in a Canadian context is you actually show the money first and foremost, right? You need to actually show that there's a financial commitment behind what you're saying. Canada is an expert at making promises, but then having no financial backing behind it. So the government's actually taking a different tact here, putting the money up front and then saying, okay, we'll work out the details of where that money is headed next. That said, I think it's important that they work that out. It is incumbent upon the government to produce its defense industrial strategy in short order. It's incumbent upon the government to get its national security strategy out, and it's incumbent upon the government to get its defense policy flowing from that national security strategy out. And maybe as we can discuss a little bit further, this isn't just important in terms of moving that money. It's also important because the government is currently, as we're seeing with this whole debate over the F-35 versus the Gripen, engaged in a bit of a tug of war right now with the CAF about who decides Canadian defense policy. And the best way the government can decide defense policy is by issuing a defense policy.
I 100% agree. I was having a conversation with a former very senior general, and I mentioned the fact that a spending target is not a strategy, and the fact that we still haven't really seen where the government stands on the last defense policy update. You don't see them standing by it, doubling down on it. And that might make sense because the geopolitical landscape, especially as it relates to the United States' place in the world and how they're working with allies, has changed, which obviously needs to be reflected in any defense policy that we have. If the government isn't standing firm on the last defense policy update, then really, where's the direction coming from on what the Canadian Forces needs to put its money and its resources and its emphasis behind? And the general pushed back and he said, well, we don't really want our politicians making those decisions. And I thought, no, we do want our elected officials making those decisions. Precisely how they're executed is something we should be leaving for the professionals of the Canadian Armed Forces and D&D. But precisely what the objectives of the Canadian Armed Forces and our national defense policy should be coming from our elected officials. And I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing good conversation from our L1s, from the head of the Army and Navy and the Air Force about where they're going. Obviously, the Navy and the Air Force has to deal with the subs and aircraft issue. General Wright last night at an event said he's really lucky because he doesn't have to deal with those things. He's more concerned about bullets, weapons, and uniforms. They all have modernization plans. You need to have a strategy behind what capabilities you need and how you're going to get them to where. And that needs to come from our elected officials. So far, that's not been coming quickly, at least.
And I would even go a little bit further, where when the budget says and when the government's announced on a number of issues that Buy Canadian is going to be put front and center for all procurement, including defense procurement, the CAF isn't going to do that until they are given direction to do that, quite simply. I just mean it in the sense that right now, to your point, they are working with the force planning assumptions of the 2017 defense policy and the 2024 defense policy update, both of which predate President Trump's second term and which are very focused on the Canada-US relationship in terms of the mission sets and the capabilities that you're going to develop. If you want the CAF to pivot from that, and you want it to be consistent and coherent, and you also want, as the announcement of the Defense Investment Agency indicated, if you also want to bring defense industrial considerations much earlier in the acquisition process, namely in options analysis, when the technical requirements are ironed, you're going to need policy direction to that effect. And I think this is what's interesting, right? I mean, for those of us, the three of us who teach in a policy school, people sometimes think the policy doesn't really matter. What really matters is what the experts tell you that you need to do, and policy is just window dressing. In cases like this, policy really matters. In the absence of clear policy direction, bureaucracies will hunker down and just keep doing what they want to do. If the government is serious about its ambitions, it's going to need to provide clear policy direction.
If I can just make maybe a snarky point here, we have seen a lot of former generals, a lot of former military people starting to rally around the F-35. I don't want to suggest that these generals have
Financial interest?
Know where their consultancies lie, for example. And look, I mean, the King and Queen of Sweden were here. I don't think it was just a friendly visit. Everyone is really trying to drive this process, trying to influence this policy. This is a really interesting point. Where are these decisions made? Where should these decisions be made? And just thinking about this, I'm wondering how you guys are reflecting on this.
Well, I think to your point, I'm going to be generous to everybody involved here. In the absence, let's just assume that everybody's well-intentioned. If you're arguing strongly that Canada should absolutely stick to the F-35 and shouldn't even consider a mixed fleet, chances are you're laser focused on the technical requirement and you're focused on a mission set laid out in 2017, 2020. As long as you're focused on that mission set and you say, we want the Canadian Armed Forces to fully integrate in a continental defense system with the United States with no hiccups, and we don't want to ruffle that relationship in any way, and we're going to assume that the United States will continue to wage operations internationally, including against potential peer adversaries, and Canada needs to be there. And we're going to assume that's the case, and therefore we also need the F-35. So if you focus just on that piece of the equation, then it leads you very easily to say you have no choice here. Any consideration of anything else is foolish. The government doesn't view it that way. They also have said it explicitly. I mean, I think the industry minister, Melanie Joly, has been the most explicit, saying she cares about jobs. She cares about industrial policy. She cares about building up capacity.
And I don't think Canada's unique in that.
And I think the thing is, we've become so used to, in this country, trying to optimize that defense dollar. So trying to get the maximum capability for the least amount of spend, which means basically being plug and playing with the U.S. military. And it's kind of worked well for us for several decades. You get a lot of capability on the cheap. But the government suddenly has a different set of priorities. I think that's where a lot of the military folk and former military folk are running into a bit of a cognitive dissonance here, trouble, where the government has the confidence of the House of Commons. Its budget is just passed. It won because it outlined a particular vision of how it wants to invest in Canada. And it may be wrong. It may be completely foolish. It may just be headed towards failure. But democratic civil military relations says that the government gets to make that call, and it gets to make other considerations, or at least put forward other considerations, such as industrial policy, such as sovereign capability, when it is investing in defense capability. And my big concern here is the assumption, as you were kind of hinting at, that somehow politicians don't get to make these decisions. That gets us into very dangerous territory. And I really worry that too many on the uniform side are adopting kind of no compromise attitude. It's a little bit like, if you want to make sure that the 3.5% of GDP becomes the new carbon tax, adopt the same attitude that the climate community did. No compromise, absolutely 100% committed, will not move off of it, will not engage in any discussion about it, and then let it be torn asunder by a future government. We've seen this lesson, right?
Time and time again with major projects in the Canadian Armed Forces.
And also with any kind of major policy that's contentious, right? If you want to set your policy up for long-term failure, never compromise, treat anybody who disagrees with you as the enemy, and don't understand where the other side is coming from, and then suddenly be shocked when you fail to win people over.
Part of the question around the big dollar value of the budget going towards the CAF and D&D is the age-old problem of, can the CAF even spend the money? Part of the efforts to rectify that long-standing issue is the establishment of the Defense Investment Agency. So, Phil, what's your take on the DIA and what you've seen around the announcements so far?
Just a few points. Even before the DIA, the government contracting regulations were updated, making it easier to put forward national security exemptions. I think it's an important part of this story that we have to keep in the back of our minds. And this has come up in the budget and in the DIA announcement as well.
Explain what a national security exemption is.
So basically, it allows Canada to circumvent certain international trade rules and competition rules that would normally go to the CITT.
Right.
And invoke the national security exemptions. You can say things like, because we want to build sovereign capacity here, or because we want to do this for national security reasons, we're going to just avoid a competition. Some very smart people around procurement in recent years have been trying to shift the conversation, saying there's a difference between fair, open, transparent, always competitive. You can still be fair, you can be transparent, but you don't always have to be competitive, as long as you're clear about that at the outset. So that's the background. Now, DIA, in a perfect world, would put everybody in the same building and under the same decision makers. So part of the criticism over the years is that each part of the defense procurement system has different incentives and different goals. D&D, CAF is focused on technical requirements. Treasury Board is focused on risk. ISET is focused on industrial benefits. And PSPC is focused on contracting. Can you better align them such that everybody's working under, in this case, the same CEO of this agency, so that at least you get greater harmonization between the different parts of the procurement system?
One way I think about this is the age-old, you can't have cheap, fast, and good, and that those different parts of the incentive structure each wanted one of those elements. And so now The idea being if there's one decision maker at the top, they'll decide what the priority is going to be in terms of, is it going to be cheap? Is it going to be fast? Or is it going to meet all the technical requirements? Because you can't have three. And so having somebody decide, no, we just want fast. So we're going to spend the money. We want fast and good. So we're going to spend the money. Having one person leading that whole effort will help streamline and help get rid of that tension of each stakeholder moving towards a different element of that triangle. That's fair.
Phil, you've written about that recently. A really fascinating post, the iron triangle. You had me at iron triangle. It also reminds me of that instrument you used to play in kindergarten.
I did that in middle school because that was the only thing I was capable of playing.
Fair.
I also just want to make a couple points here. I mean, let's bring in both the military side of this, a military concept and an academic concept, since we're all profs at the same school and like teaching this to our students, showing that what we teach them actually has policy relevance. Bureaucratic politics
Listen up,
matters.
kids. Listen up.
Bureaucratic politics matters, right? So where you sit is where you stand, right? This is a classic Graham Allison, Cuban Missile Crisis, the bureaucratic politics concept. If you sit within an organization and you don't see yourself, and you see yourself kind of working with the people working on the other pieces of that puzzle, right? It should, in an ideal world, lead you to at least have the same objective in mind. If everybody's at least thinking that they're part of the same entity and they're all aiming to achieve the same thing under a single leader giving them direction, great. The military concept is mission command. When you have multiple different departments and a central agency, each telling you that you have a different mission, that's basically what we had. Everybody had a different mission within that rubric. If you now have a single mission, namely, we want you to acquire this for Canadian purposes or whatever, can you get the people to better align? Now, you're also going to have to, and the government hinted at this on a number of occasions, radically strip down the process and hopefully accept more risk. But I think the one point of caution here is the government also needs to signal to the bureaucracy that it's got its back if they accept more risk. Again, bringing back the academic theory here, right? Breaking the bargain with the public service. If you tell the public service to accept more risk, but then you're not going to back them when things inevitably sometimes go wrong, then why, as a bureaucracy, would you take that risk?
That is an interesting question because I think it goes back to this conversation we were just having about everybody being on board and it not becoming a political hot potato, making the next carbon tax, right? There's a little bit of, you also need the opposition parties to be on board with the mission. If the mission is putting defense of Canada first as its strong industrial policy and getting everybody on board, rowing in the same direction. Because if not, they're going to see all of this as an opportunity to find fault in government and bureaucratic decision-making and make it the next carbon tax. I don't think the government has really shown signs that they are working towards bringing the opposition on side. The fact that they were quite happy to not make any concessions on the budget maybe is reflective of that. Do you think my fear or that I'm articulating here is valid, or do you think it's something that the government really needs to work on, is getting everybody on side with this strategy that is not a full strategy yet, but it seems like if we actually want all Canadians on board and for risk to be something that we're willing to accept, the opposition can't be beating the government over the head with it at all opportunity.
Right. And I think it's less the government's job than it is Canadians, to be honest, on this one. So I don't think it would be that difficult to get the NDP on board. I don't think it'll be that difficult to get the Bloc on board with this, provided that there's enough benefit for Quebec. The biggest stumbling block is whether or not the Conservative Party stays fully wedded to a Reaganite version of conservatism, where lower deficits, lower debts, and balanced budgets are the absolute quinine of statecraft, right? As long as you're doing that, everything else is fine. If that remains the lodestar, the North Star of the Conservative Party, then you have a problem, right? Because eventually they will come into power and they're going to have to balance the budget. And what nobody talks about is that it's the defense spend that is going to be your number one lever. Getting them on board with this is going to be critical to the long-term viability of this. And I think it's more a question of, does the Conservative Party see benefits in this? Do they actually see it paying off? Because we don't want an opposition party that doesn't oppose, right? We still want them pointing out where the fault lines are or why things aren't going well. So we want them to hold the government to account, and we want them to hold their feet to the fire. But they can still do so while agreeing with the general direction, right? There's a difference between disagreeing with the fundamental direction you're taking and disagreeing with how you're implementing it. And I think we want them more on criticizing the implementation as opposed to the policy.
I'm nodding vigorously.
I think this is the really big challenge, right? I don't see any evidence right now that the conservative movement in Canada is heading in that direction. I think they are still 100% locked in to balancing budgets as the number one priority. And if that happens, then yeah, this policy is vulnerable.
Backing away slightly from the political question and more about the practicality question, because maybe the political question gets solved if this is shown to work. I don't know if that's the case or not. I'm not in anyone's political room and saying
It gets even messier down south.
100%. So I guess my question about this new Defense Investment Agency, and I will note it, like, it's not Defense Procurement Agency, which has been long discussed. They use the term investment. I'm assuming there's a little politicking there. But if this new investment agency is going to work, you have suggested the most important thing of this triangle that you discuss, right? This kind of series of trade-offs that the government effectively has to make when it's buying things, that time is the most important. Do you think that this is the right approach to increasing the speed at which we can procure things?
I don't think the agency itself speeds things up, but if it's accompanied by a greater willingness to use certain mechanisms to speed things up, then yes. So I'll credit Ian Mack, a former ADM Matt guy, and also Rear Admiral, with the term schedule is king. Really, this idea that no matter what else, if you actually want to make the maximum use of your defense dollar, whether on a capability or quality side, you have to get it. You have to purchase quickly. Otherwise, the purchasing power of that dollar just diminishes to such an extent that you're not meeting any of your other objectives. The submarines is a good example. If we pull that off, I think it will be very telling in terms of how we can do things differently. Because your listeners will recall, right, when it came to warships, in part because we needed Irving to work on a cartridge patrol fleet first, the Navy took its time developing its requirements. It really, took a long time kind of refining them, building the best possible warships that it could. Now the Navy's just coming at it from a very different direction, saying, look, we don't care how this thing works. We don't even care if the manuals are in English. Just get us a boat. And that is the most important thing.
We'll be able to get in it, get up to the Arctic, sail for 2 weeks and come back. Yeah. That's what we care about.
We need the boat above, and bureaucratically, it makes sense. You want to commit to this thing. Financially, it makes sense. The longer you wait, the less capable it's going to be within the dollar spend that you have. That's a very different attitude. And ultimately, if we apply this construct to other things, namely, and this is well known in the procurement literature, get your minimum viable product first. Get the minimum viable product, then put in place a continuous capability sustainment framework where you constantly better it and make it. But all that requires buying things more often and more quickly. And that is probably the biggest hurdle that we face within Government of Canada. We can get into the minutiae of some of this, but for something, the minute that you improve on a capability under Canadian contracting regulations, it becomes a capital project. And all the rules that surround that, all the layers of oversight, all the complications that entails immediately come into play. And that's just not realistic in a world where technology changes and you can't even buy your current capability anymore. You inevitably are ending up improving upon what you're buying, right? So how do we do that more often and more quickly without tangling ourselves up in all these complex webs?
I also want to ask you about the not hard material procurement, software and technical capabilities, and the integration of AI into systems is another major area where we've seen the government say they want to invest. But we all know that the standard procurement process doesn't work well when you're talking about the integration of new technology. There's been lots of talk about entry into supply agreements. So what do you see going forward? There's really nothing in the budget that spoke to that other than we need to do more on AI and tech. but I didn't really see what the plan was for that element of modernization.
So the Public Services and Procurement Canada has been working on defense procurement reform for many years now. And part of that work has involved identifying different procurement pathways for those that are interested. Defense Acquisition University in the United States has a whole kind of
There's a whole university about defense acquisition?
Yeah. So they have all these different pathways that they've developed, and it's all freely available. You can see how they work and how they apply to different things. Government of Canada knows that these exist, right? They know that there's other ways of doing things. All the knowledge is there of how you might do it. The challenge is, and they've done a lot of this work under the ADN Defense Procurement Reform. Can they then port that in to DIA and make it real, right? We know what we need to do. We know how to do it. Can we bring it into DIA? And most importantly, how the hell do you convince Treasury Board and the Treasury Board Secretariat to allow you to do this? And this is where I think the power of the Prime Minister and his fortitude is going to really be tested. I mean, you think fighting the CAF is hard? Just wait until you're fighting TBS. So how do you get TBS on board with what you're trying to do? If they can manage to convince them that these alternative procurement pathways are feasible in Canada and could be tried, then that answers your question, because there's different ones for software, there's different ones for consumables, there's different ones for other things. And if you can tailor your procurement processes to what you're trying to do, as opposed to trying to apply a blanket one across the board, then you'll have a lot more success.
Doesn't this then also come down to political decision-making, making policy direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think this, again, not to get too conspiratorial kind of deep state here, but like there's a culture in the Canadian bureaucracy, right? And it's a tough nut to crack. Much like the CAF is just waiting for all this to change so they can go back to their relationship with the United States and pretend this was a really bad dream. A large segment of the Canadian bureaucracy, particularly on the auditing, surveillance, and policy side, is just waiting for all this to pass so they can go back and be super risk averse and make sure the DMs sign for coffee, and that's good management, right? That's so deeply ingrained. It's hard to shake off.
Phil, my final question to you is something that's been in the backdrop of this entire conversation, which is this tension we're having now between, does the U.S. come back, or do we need to carve out our own way and start being more sovereign? We see this in the F-35 debate, and we've already talked about that. You mentioned it there when it comes to the entire procurement process. I see this tension a little bit, too, in your own writing, going back to your post about procurement and to Leah's point about the other kinds of procurement, right? We think in terms of ships, bullets, stuff like that, but the data. We need to procure places to host our data. You mentioned, and you talk about this in procurement, and you talk about the idea of a sovereign cloud, and you kind of downplay that, and you say, well, here speed is king, and we need this capability now, and therefore we should just go with existing service providers like Amazon Web Services. I do note that last week, the director of the service said that actually the protection of Canadian data held overseas now is a key national security issue. He said, quote, at the same time, Canada's data increasingly resides in the hands of foreign governments and the corporations in their jurisdictions. This armed state may choose to act against Canada's interests with new ways to weaponize data and information. That was interesting. He's not saying the U.S. is out to get us or anything like that, but it is a really interesting point. The head of Microsoft in France, famously this summer, had to say at a hearing that he could not guarantee that he wouldn't hand over data if the United States government asked for it. We're seeing the International Criminal Court having to use open source software now because they've revoked Microsoft licenses because of U.S. sanctions on judges. I wonder how you're thinking about that issue and why you think it's okay for us to go with Amazon Web Services in this particular case, and how we should be thinking about sovereignty overall in this budget.
So the comment I had in the post is more trying to figure out what the government actually has in mind in terms of the timelines that it's set out, right? That was kind of my bigger concern of saying, you want to spend...
My question is why you are a traitor.
I told you I had a bone to pick with you about your blog, and it was this.
So what I'm saying is the government is going to spend $11 billion on digital infrastructure in 5 years for D&D, CAF, and CSE. Okay? 5 years. How's it going?
They've already started, to be fair, even before they announced it in the budget.
They've been working on it for some time. I think there's two kind of prime questions for me. The first is we're already doing classified cloud in NORAD context with AWS. So we're already down the path a little bit here. The question then becomes, within a Five Eyes construct, and you guys know this better than I do, there may be some things that can only be shared on some of these types of servers. Now, does that preclude Canada from setting up its own for its own proprietary information? What I'm saying is, all things being equal, we should. But I'm also looking at the timelines and I'm going, how are you doing this in 5 years with $11 billion? The Australians have done a hybrid thing with AWS. The Brits are with AWS. So I'm kind of sitting there going, I don't know how you pull it off. Like that amount of money with a sovereign capability on your own without a plan. Like, what's the plan, man?
This is essentially what the CSIS director was trying to get at. Because I asked a follow-up question after his comment. The media also asked the follow-up question about, so what are you suggesting? And he basically said, well, this is above my pay grade. So he's basically saying, like, this is a problem. And it was the only thing I found in his speech was where he was getting political. He was making a statement about this is a national security problem that we need to address. If we don't, it is a problem for Canadian national security. Because the previous government could have cut a check to AWS years ago when everybody else was doing it, and they did not. So it leads me to believe that there are those in the government making the case, even prior to Trump, saying this is not in our national security interests. So I do think you're right. I suspect we would have to do some sort of hybrid. Whenever I talk to really smart cyber people about data sovereignty, it's not about the data. We can keep the data here. It's about data transit and authentication. Because if you're going with any of the American service providers, you can't control that. And so you can just switch off authentication, which means nobody can access it, even if it's stored here, right? So like there are other considerations that we need to be thinking about when we think about data sovereignty. And I think the CSIS director laid a little flag there because I'm suspecting that there are decisions that are having to be made and they have not been made yet.
Well, I think that's the key thing for me is it's very easy to say this principle holds, and we do have very clear regulations in this country around data sovereignty, which explains why we haven't moved as quickly as the Australians and the UK on this stuff. And I think what's been happening in the US has reinforced the wisdom of those policies. It's one of those things where you go, this is a classic Canadian move. Your listeners may be aware of the movie Monty Python, The Holy Grail. Lancelot is charging a castle. And the guard is just looking. He sees this guy running to him and running at the castle. He's like, huh. And he turns away and you see it again, same distance. Like Lancelot hasn't moved. And the guard is again going, what's going on here? And then he looks a third time. Again, he's running towards him, hasn't changed the distance. And then suddenly he springs on him and attacks him. And it's the joke being like, you didn't see it coming, even though you clearly did. And so you're sitting there on some of this and you're going, the Canadian government for more than a decade has been looking at this problem going, huh. No, that's a problem.
Admire the problem, as we like to say.
Yeah. And then you're chomping on your apple as the guy does in the movie. You're like, oh, there's a problem. You see a program running to the scene, you don't do anything about it. So now we're sitting here way behind everybody else, already kind of locked into these systems in our bilateral command, expecting Canadian industry to suddenly do this really quickly. And this is what I think is interesting is you need to be realistic about what you're going to achieve in your short term and what you hope to achieve over the long term. This is not just data sovereignty. This is everything. This is
every kind of procurement we're talking about right now, right?
Our entire armed forces are in this situation, right? And probably you guys know on the intelligence side, same thing. Like we're so dependent and we're going to be for the foreseeable time horizon of 5 to 10 years. There's no question about that. The question for me is, okay, what comes after? When you're dealing with that long-term time horizon, what alternative are you developing? So when I see a government come and tell me, oh yeah, we're spending $11 billion on this capability that currently doesn't exist in Canada, and we're somehow going to pull it off on a cash basis before 2030, I'm like, I don't know, man. Like, I can't help but feel you're probably going to go with a bit of a hybrid system.
Phil, thanks for coming on and explaining some of the issues around the budget. I'm sure we'll have you come on when it's either going spectacularly well or a catastrophic failure.
Or maybe we get some sort of defense industrial policy or a national security policy or any of those things.
We've all been promised. It's like Schrodinger's national security strategy. Or to go back to Monty Python, it's not dead yet. But on that note, I just want to, give a huge thanks to you for coming on the pod. You're very busy these days. Just a reminder to listeners, if you like what you hear, please email us, please rate or subscribe so others can find us as well. Thanks again and see you soon.
Thanks.